Good morning. Good morning. It is great to be with you all today, especially on this celebration day that we found the owl's head. It's always great to be with the congregation when they celebrate things. I was wondering a little bit if I'd actually get here. I live in Columbus. These days, the Columbus Marathon. And I've lived in Columbus for a while, and I thought I knew how to get around that. But I don't know if they changed the streets or not. But there was one point along the way that it was as though I kind of went up into the sky and looked down on myself, and I felt like one of those mice in those mazes, you know, when I was turning right and left, and the cheese was Interstate 71. I was just trying to get any way I could get there, and I finally found it. So happy to be here with you, and thank you, Kevin, for the invitation. Am I getting some feedback? I don't know if I need the lavalier. No, you can't hear me at all. You want me to use this one or the lavalier?
Go ahead and use the lavalier. I'll play with it.
Okay. No problem. Well, I will just keep talking one more time. It's kind of like the journey here, right? We just find our way around. It's actually sort of fitting that I went through that, because what I want to talk to you a little bit about today is how the church is finding our way through these times today. I just came back from Cleveland, and we had a council of conference ministers meeting, and that's all the conference ministers of the United Church of Christ. There's 37 of us, and we were talking about what was going on in the churches all across our denomination, and there are some very, very similar themes as we see significant changes in our society around how people interact with religion and how they deal with their spirituality. As they say, the cheese has been moved for us in the church. We used to know exactly how to run things, and really all you needed to do was to build a church and have a pastor and open the door, and everybody went to church, and so everybody kind of divided out and filled those buildings. And we know that over the years that has been changing. And Pew Research that just came out not too long ago, the number of people that said they are religious or spiritual but not religious has now hit 25%. And that's the highest that we've ever seen. But there continues to be this interest that people have in spiritual things. Depending on where I am, if I'm flying on a plane or even out at a restaurant or someplace like that, when people ask me what I do, I always have that moment where I'm not sure what I should say. Because I'm also a social worker, so sometimes I go with that route. Because once you tell them you're a minister, all bets are off. I've had people turn around and walk away. I've had people ask me to baptize them right there. I don't know, a glass of water. It's just very, you find that as well. It's kind of a mixed bag as to the response we get. But when people find out I'm a minister, and then they go through the process and usually end up apologizing for any cuss words they might have said, and we go through that whole thing. Every time, almost every time, we get into conversations about faith. And they're not forced, and they're not fake. They're very genuine. So people are still, even in this highly technological world, are still pulled and drawn to God. And for us, as the church, our main task is to figure out how we continue to move through all these changes and find ways to help people and help all of us live out our faith and change the world. But it's becoming more and more of a challenge. Scripture passage today is one of those passages that makes you cringe a little bit. You know, Abraham casts out his Hagar and her son, his son, and they're kind of out there in the wilderness. But it's amazing what happens in the wilderness, that moment when they're in their most and greatest need, that God comes and provides. There's something about being willing to go into the wilderness that helps us figure things out. Jesus did it, right? Right after he was baptized, went out into the wilderness. We see through scriptures that actually the wilderness is the place of discernment, oftentimes. About 9 years ago, my dad passed away, and that was a really significant moment in my life. I was very close to my dad. As I was trying to figure out, how you live this life without your dad, without one of your greatest heroes, I had the thought, well, maybe I'll do some traveling. Because I hadn't really traveled. My dad was in the Navy, and I always got the comment from him, I've traveled all over the world. The only place I want to see is here, I grew up on a farm, so we had animals. We couldn't leave them very much. So I decided I would travel. I decided once a month I would go somewhere. And at that point I was working as a social worker for Children's Services. So I sat down and made out my plan, and I set up the budget. I looked at that number and I thought, well, that's never going to happen. So it was a plan, I spent a good couple hours feeling good about it, and I kind of tucked it away. And not long after that, I got a call from an insurance agent, and he said that my dad had bought a life insurance policy on me when I was born, when I was young, and that it had a savings account attached to it. He said, you might as well come and get that money now and take that. So I went to the insurance agent's office. I sat down across from the table, and he slid the check over to me. And I picked it up, and it was for the exact amount that I figured it would cost me to travel for that year. I felt like it was a gift from my dad. And so I began to travel. A couple weeks later, I found a round-trip airfare ticket to Amsterdam for $288. But I had to leave in like 3 days. So I bought it, packed up the bag. I didn't have anybody go with me. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't have a place to stay. I just got on the plane. You see, in all this kind of turmoil of my life and not knowing what I was going to do next, I figured the best thing to do was to get on the edge, get on the edge of that almost panic place and see where it would lead me. Well, I also figured, I grew up near Columbus. I thought, Amsterdam probably is a lot like Columbus. It's not, but prepare you if you head over there. And so I flew over there, and I got out of the train station, and I'm walking up out the steps, and I'm looking around, and I'm just, I can't believe I'm here, and I'm just like classic tourist and walking. And all of a sudden, 10 seconds into my journey in Amsterdam, all of a sudden people started screaming. There were noises and crashes around me. It was just deafening. And what I had done was I had accidentally walked out into the bike path, which, if you know Amsterdam, they don't like that. That's not, and they started saying things to me that I couldn't understand, but I felt like they were mean words. They were screaming, and so I jumped out that way, and my heart pounding, and all of a sudden I started thinking, maybe I made a mistake. That's, you decide to venture out into the adventure, and then the next thing that happens, sometimes 10 seconds into it, you think, I think this was a mistake. It ended up being a magnificent trip. And I spent the rest of the year traveling, went to all sorts of places, did all sorts of things. And I realized at that moment that although my tendency, when I got confused or didn't know what to do, is to step back and close myself off, I realized at that moment that the answers are much more clearer when you step out into the wilderness and into the adventure. You see, that's where we are with the church. And I've now been the conference minister of over 1,000 congregations. And I see some congregations that respond by circling the wagons and not knowing what to do, so they do what they've always done before, and they get smaller, and the world gets smaller around them. And I see other congregations that are willing to take a risk, to experiment, to try some new things, and see what happens. That's where we are. And we have the opportunity in the United Church of Christ, especially I think in the United Church of Christ, to create spaces for people to come that have never come before, right? Whoever you are, wherever you are on life's journey, you're welcome here. Right? God is still speaking. Come join us and listen. And so, as I come to you today, and I've been hearing about your church, and Kevin serves on the board for the conference, and so I've been hearing about you, and I know about you, and even my time here today tells me there's so much here. And there's so much potential for even more. I can tell, I can sense it. But what moves us into that is being willing to go into the wilderness. I've been playing around with the idea of rewilding. Have you heard of that term before? So it's a concept that environmentalists use. And the idea is you should take the animals and the things that were at a place before and reintroduce them because nature kind of had it figured out before humankind messed with it. So back in the mid-90s, as an example, the U.S. government began to reintroduce wolves into Yellowstone National Park. And they did it very quietly because wolves are that kind of, we have this human response to wolves that they're bad, you know, Red Riding Hood had problems with them, and so we have this idea, but they reintroduced the wolves because when the wolves were gone, the deer population just began to decimate the park. And although they tried to control the deer, they couldn't do it. So they just reintroduced the wolves, these wild things, just a handful of them. And what they found was, yeah, the wolves did hunt some of the deer, but they found the deer's responses to the presence of the wolves was amazing. They stopped going into places where they might get cornered and caught. And so that let the areas grow up with trees, and the trees and stuff quadrupled in size within a couple of years. And because there were more trees and bushes and all those things, more animals came in, and more hawks came in. Then the beavers came in because they like wood, and then they started to affect the environment as well. What was the most amazing thing about the reintroduction of these wolves, this wildness back into the park, was that they impacted and changed the course of the rivers. Because now that everything wasn't eaten on the sides, the rivers were more stable. Because the beaver were there, they began to create these giant ponds and lakes. See, the presence of this wildness created something amazing. And so I ask you, what is the wildness that God's calling you to do? Because I found that the United Church of Christ does its best work when we're doing a little bit of wild stuff. That's when we feel like we have the most energy. When we reach out to the most people. When we invite the people in that others won't invite in. When we stand up for the poor and for those that are isolated far louder than anyone else will. When we do our wild stuff, God changes the flow of our life. I'll close with this. I began pastoring when I was 20 years old. I don't know what they were thinking, but I started when I was 20 years old, and I was in this small little church, had 2 churches, and in a small little church there was this family that were amazing people. They were just wonderful people, worked in the church all the time, great people. They were just not very clean people. And having kind of grown up in a house where we weren't, OCD or anything, but cleanliness was important, I had a hard time sometimes interacting with the family. And so one day, the grandmother came up with her little granddaughter, probably that tall, and she said, Reverend, she said, it's our granddaughter's birthday. She said, would you come over to our house for dinner and for the birthday party? And I thought, dinner? From their kitchen? It's all the things you're not supposed to think as a pastor, but I did, right? I'm a human being. And so I said, well, I have appointments. I can't make it for dinner, but I can come over after the party, or for the party. She said, that's fine, that's great. So I sat at home watching the clock, trying to figure out when they were done with dinner. And then I went over to the house. And they were done with dinner, but it was cake time. And so I walked in and they asked me, they said, do you want a piece of cake? And I kind of hemp-hauled around. And so they got me a piece of cake. This little girl whose birthday was brought it over to me, and it was in a bowl. She gave it to me, and she's smiling and just so excited. And I didn't have a utensil for it. So the grandmother went over to the table where they had just finished eating and picked up a spoon off of one of the plates. And then shook it to get the food off, and then cleaned it on her shirt. And then handed it to me. My stomach was going, all of a sudden. So I was holding that bowl, and that little girl was looking up at me, and she was, smiling, and was kind of blondish hair. Probably if it had been cleaner, it would have been pure blonde. But she was just so happy, so excited I was there. And so I was holding that cake, and I prayed. I said, Lord God, creator of all things, please kill whatever needs to be killed in this bowl. In Jesus' name, amen. Right? And I kept thinking, is that mashed potatoes on tasty? It was just well, later on I found out that wasn't just a piece of cake. That was actually the last piece of cake that they had. And it wasn't just the last piece of cake. It was that little girl's piece of cake that she gave. My friends, the wilderness, the adventure, the unknown, the things we have never done before, might be scary, but it's also where God is. That is our opportunity. Thanks be to God.